All right, well, welcome everyone. I'm Nick Becker. I'm the CEO of GeoPoll, and this is my colleague Mattieu Sauvage-Mar, who runs our VP of Client Services. We're here today to tell you about designing surveys for hard-to-reach areas where we're often stricken by poverty in emerging markets throughout the world. We've spent, as a company, the last 5 years building up our survey capabilities in some of the hardest to reach places in the world, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, and Southeast Asia. Through the way we go about doing this, and just give you a little bit of background on GeoPoll, is we connect with mobile network operators that give us three key pieces of connectivity. One is the ability to send them messages through SMS or connect with them over voice. We have the ability to transact with them by distributing airtime and or mobile money. And then lastly, they give us access to be able to target their user base, which allows us to geographically target people in hard to reach places. Take, for instance, DR Congo. They have less than a couple thousand miles of actual paved road in the country, so getting out to some of those harder to reach places is physically impossible, and that's where a lot of our mobile technology comes into play. As you can see from this video, this is an actual survey that we've kind of taken a desktop survey and kind of condensed it down into a mobile phone from one of our employees in Nairobi. And he's actually taking the survey and going through one of these matrix questions. Now you can see that this is taking this desktop survey and getting it to work on a mobile phone that's, it's an older feature phone, is not the best user experience. The data is slow to load. He has to scroll sideways to see which each one is, and then you can't even see the top. So this is an example of kind of what not to do. And I don't know if you have any.
This was a survey that happened to run across the marketplace as well. So these are some of the respondent experiences that the GeoPoll respondents go through, and so we just wanted to make sure we put it at the front of the presentation because that's really for GeoPoll. One of the big advantages is the reach, is ultimately the ability to communicate with mobile phone subscribers in Kenya, in Nigeria, and the like. And we'll get into it a little bit more in detail, some of these challenges.
Yeah, so yeah, as you can see, they're all over the place on this one. So over the past 5 years, we've actually made a ton of mistakes and learned a lot of lessons, and that's kind of what we're here to share with you guys today. Just to set the stage a little bit beyond this video, imagine taking a survey on your way home from work. Most of us would think of being in a car, sitting on a train, but what we're actually dealing with in a lot of these places is this is what their commute looks like. And this is the Gamblero, it's a famous matatu in Nairobi, and this is actually taken not far from our office, and a lot of our employees actually use this as their transportation to and from work. Driving is just unattainable, and having cars is unattainable, and this is the mode of public transfer. So just to set the stage of what kind of environment you're dealing with, this is what it looks like on an everyday basis. The other things that we look at are, what does your phone look like? A lot of us in this room have iPhones, Android phones, latest smartphones. They're all touch screen. The majority of the phones that we're dealing with do not have that. They're still click buttons. They're still candy bar phones. And we're looking at penetration rates that are anywhere from 25 to 50% smartphones. But of those people that have smartphones, they don't use them smartly. They actually don't have the funds or the means to get a data connection. So they may have a smartphone, but it has no internet on it. So these are some of the problems that we have to solve when we're trying to conduct market research in some of these places. So why does this matter?
I can pick it up from here. So really, more than half of the world's population under 30 live in emerging markets in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So GeoPoll's focus, and ultimately I think a lot of our focus, is in terms of finding the new consumers. This is where it's going to be coming from. These are where consumers are. So whether they be our clients, they might be more focused right now in places like Cincinnati, LA, Europe markets. Where the world is going and where the consumers are going to be are in Nigeria, are in Nairobi, Kenya, are in Mumbai. So it's going to be much more international, and it's something we as an industry, and particularly GeoPoll, has been focused on. Just to put this in context, and I think many of you know this stat, but the highest market research growth rates in 2017 were in the Middle East and Asia. That's pretty much continued in 2018, in the past year. It's where I hear a lot of the international expansion, a lot of where the growth is. GeoPoll really is focused on Sub-Saharan Africa. We think we're looking at the next phase where it's going to be North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa. We think that's going to be the growth. Asia is pretty broad here. I'd argue also Southeast Asia. So really a large opportunity engaging with some of the highest populations where there's a need. This new consumer class is coming online, but not through traditional methods, right? So I think most of us are all familiar with online surveys here in the US, primarily going to desktop computers. In Sub-Saharan Africa, they've really leapfrogged that. Their focus is on they're buying feature phones and or smartphones. There aren't any desktop computers. Even in the professional services, in our offices, most people are still using tablets. So we're going to have to be thinking about different ways of engaging with these respondents. And online, believe it or not, is going to become an antiquated and traditional methodology in our minds. So, or at least online in the way we think about it here in the US or in Europe. Just this graph will illustrate it a little bit more in data terms. The blue line is the mobile cell phone kind of penetration. Orange line is the individuals accessing the internet. Like yellow, I guess, is the active mobile broadband. And then what I will point out, too, is the gray one is the fixed telephone subscription. So this is globally what we're seeing throughout. And this is a stat that we're all very familiar with. I'd argue probably in emerging markets is even more pronounced. So really where our focus needs to be is, in terms of on the market research side, is focusing on these consumers, right? Individuals that are accessing the internet, but not only are they accessing it, they're accessing it through a mobile phone. When I talk about the web traffic on mobile phones, you'll see just in the past year from 2015 to 2018, or the past 3 years, tremendous increase, nearly 30% of web traffic is being done on mobile phones. That figure probably is even more pronounced, as I said again, in emerging markets. That's going to be a general theme that I keep going back to, is what we're seeing in countries like Pakistan or South Africa. You're looking at mobile web traffic being nearly 80%. You look at countries like Mexico, Indonesia, still in the mid-range, but desktop, there is some more access to desktop computers, but that's still largely going to be a certain affluent or a wealthier population. So if you really want to reach the broad group of respondents, and or what we would argue is when we were talking about sample earlier in terms of a nationally representative population, we really would encourage you to be thinking about mobile first.
And one key thing on this one in particular is that in a lot of these markets, they are leapfrogging. They're not even stopping at the tablet or at the laptop phase or the desktop phase. They just completely bypass that and they're going straight to mobile. And that's really what we're seeing here in South Africa. And South Africa has some of the better penetration rates of laptops on the continent that we deal with.
Absolutely. This one, I don't know, it might be helpful. I don't know, maybe you could go back, Nick, to the first slide. I just want to spend a little bit of time just on the video.
Okay.
Because, believe it or not, we spent a lot of time putting that video together with our staff. It's okay, we don't need to go back, it's fine.
It's right here. All right.
And maybe jumping into the grid question a little bit. So what we're looking at here is the respondents taking the survey or, on a basic phone, and is this a JavaScript enabled phone, you think, or?
Not likely. If it is, it's limited.
So I don't know if, Nick, you want to explain a little bit about the differences in terms of the operating software?
Yeah, so one of the things that we've noticed in there is that not only are you using older phones, but a lot of times when you're actually dealing with some of the newer phones, they're not even using the Chrome browser on Android. Android is the predominant operating system throughout Africa and a lot of the other emerging markets we deal with. But what you see is a high percentage here of the Opera browser. So Opera is it's a very light browser that it's very optimized for data so that you're not using up your data packages. But one of the big restrictions on it is it doesn't have JavaScript capabilities. It truncates the data down. It'll shrink images so they transfer quicker. So a lot of what you actually think that you're programming and you're testing on your own iPhone, they can't see any of that, and the survey just flat out won't work. And this leads to higher attrition with your sample and really can cause issues. So what we've done, and actually the video that did show, is that our technology doesn't use any of that. It's thinking about like doing mobile browsers from 2002 and utilizing that technology that is basically just sending out the full text question without using some of the fancier AJAX and videos and other things that we have available in today's mobile world in the US and other leading markets like that.
Thanks, Nick. That's helpful, because I think if you want to just go back very quickly,
yeah.
From our perspective, what we see a lot when GeoPolls, we are active and engaged on the marketplace surveys. We see a lot of the challenges we face is when we're testing in the countries that we're in, most of the surveys, the moment they get on the handheld device, doesn't even show up. And that's something related to what we're talking about in terms of the overall, the mobile browser. So I think that's why I asked Nick for a little bit of that technical point of view, because I think when clients say, okay, no, don't worry, it's mobile optimized, it's going to work great. And then when you get the survey, it's actually not only is it not just mobile optimized, but you have to be thinking about other specifics of the handheld devices in the country that we work in.
Gotcha.
Thank you. So on that note, in terms of educating and working with our clients to better understand the type of respondents or the type of users that you're engaging with, there's actually 3 different phone types that are still heavily used in the world today. There's a basic phone versus a feature phone, and there is a distinction. The basic phone we might hear more commonly known as the dumb phone. So that's the Nokia phone that we all probably played with in 2002, where you can play Snake on the phone. Then there's the feature phone, which is the same device, but it can actually connect to the internet. So that video that we saw was actually a feature phone that has basic mobile browser access. Those the device types, basic and feature phones, they are not dying. There's actually, we've noticed in the last year, we saw some data that actually the purchasing, it's actually gone up in terms of purchasing at a higher rate than smartphones.
Smartphones were selling through at a higher rate in 2016, and then that reversed course in 2017. And one of the reasons that we're dealing with some of these older phones is that the biggest issue that they have in these countries is power. You can't charge your phone, and you don't have access to it all the time. And those older phones have better batteries. They don't have a big bright screen that they have to keep lit up. So when you have to go several days without electricity, that's important. And that's why they still have these issues, and these phones aren't going away as rapidly as we would think here in this room.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And I mean, I think the big thing is also, it's not just, I mean, we just had an example this past week that South Africa, where, you know, one would argue is very strong infrastructure, great access, a lot of private sector growth. There was load shedding, which is called power sharing, where ultimately there were rolling blackouts in the country. So it's a challenge that is being faced across the continent in terms of where more and more infrastructure is being strained. I mean, some would argue maybe in the US we need to invest in some infrastructure. But then there's the smartphone, which we all know, the iPhones, the Android phones. There's not that many iPhones that are sold in sub-Saharan Africa. Certainly a larger portion are sold in Asia, but we see a much higher propensity for Android phones in the markets we work in. So when we talk about the device types, then you start to talk about, okay, the sample. I think there was a good discussion about definition of sample in this morning's conversations. We oftentimes get clients who say, okay, we would like a nationally representative online mobile survey. So my immediate response to that is not possible in the countries that GeoPoll operates in, right? So, and that would be very difficult in most countries in the world.
Some clients are okay with that. They prefer the speed and the cleanliness of the data, and the other factors that lead into wanting online desktop smartphone surveys. So if they're willing to sacrifice the national representativity, that's fine. We have that option available, and you can reach a certain percentage, and you can get results very quickly still using it.
Yeah, and I thank you for that clarification, because there's many brands who are interested in wealthy consumers who might be able to be interested in our products. You know, Philips Sonicare is not necessarily, as a brand, looking for the lower end socioeconomic class. They're looking for certain population groups, so maybe they'd be okay with that. So this is a helpful illustration that we use a lot in terms of our conversations with our customers and our partners. Just putting to the left-hand side, you'll see the socioeconomic class, and then you see the overall cost, or the CPI, for the research. So online, desktop smartphones, traditionally what we're seeing primarily on the marketplace, that's going to be, whether that be Lucid or Cint or others, that's going to be in the top left-hand bucket. So online, for online mobile optimized, so mobile browsers, just talked about those feature phones that can access the internet. It does better. You can reach a more lower income socioeconomic class and yet keep that CPI in terms of so if your client's looking for, has a limited budget, not necessarily looking for fully nationally representative, and then maybe urban population's okay, that's probably a decent mode to be going with. And then you get into conversations, if you go to the next one, in terms of conversations if the client's looking for more representativity. You look at like a country like Nigeria. It's very similar to the US in the sense that it's very large geography, 40 states, multiple different languages. You're going to need to think about different modes. And that's where SMS, text message surveys come in. That's probably 90% of the work that GeoPoll does, or maybe 80% of the work GeoPoll does is via text messages. They're always free to respond to. Respondents do need to be literate, but you can kind of be able to go to at least the literate population. Somebody, as long as they have access to a mobile phone, you can reach them.
The nice thing about SMS is that it's worked on every single phone that's produced since basically the year 2000. It's been a standard in GSM, so no matter what phone you have, you can participate. And because SMS can cost money, that's when you have to make sure that it doesn't cost the user anything. A lot of times they won't have money on their account, their prepaid account, to actually get the survey and participate in it. They don't have an unlimited text message plan. And that's why you have to make sure that you're covering that cost for them so that they can participate despite having money in their account.
Agreed. And then the other two are more of the traditional methodologies, which we see are growing in the countries we particularly work in. So computer-assisted telephone interviewing, live calls essentially. And then there's the traditional face-to-face, where you're going to get those large studies, take a few weeks to conduct, but you're going to get it on the more expensive side. All right. So yeah. So, okay. How to design surveys in a mobile-first market. So when we have the context, okay, so now we know our device type, then we know in terms of what sort of sample we want to reach based on the socioeconomic versus the cost that I have, the overall budget the client has available. How do you design surveys in a mobile-first market? I would argue these are some good tips to think about even in any market or any research that you're conducting in terms of some of the recommendations we make. We actually have quite a long list of FAQs. I tried to condense it to a few slides here, but I do want to encourage you, if you have questions, make this section a little bit more interactive, so don't hesitate to ask me questions as I go here. What not to do, multiple redirects and slow loading surveys. That really goes to something that we were just seeing on the video in the sense of data costs are high. It's going to take time for somebody to scroll through a grid type question, so it's important to be thinking about the device. Long surveys and repetitive questions, I think that's pretty ubiquitous across any country that you're in. I think we want to all avoid long surveys. User fatigue is a real challenge that we're facing across the industry. And part of that is, I think, we could start to remove repetitive questions. The beauty about mobile, whether that be using SMS or online, is that you can actually have more of a conversation with your respondent. So what GeoPoll does a lot of is we actually split up surveys into bite-size, what we call bite-size questions. So you can do the 40 questions, but you do 20 questions for them in the morning while they're in their morning commute, and then 20 questions at the end of the day, because you can reach them in real time, or practically near real time. Some best practices. Again, keeping it short and simple. 40 questions, and this is the max. I would argue you get closer to 20 to 30 questions, at least for the individual respondent. You can, of course, design many more questions, but for the respondent experience, shorter is better. Less than 10 answer choices. This is really related to, this is, I think, unique to the countries that we're talking about, in the sense that, again, to reduce that scrolling need, the need to scroll, that would help. Be direct in wording. I'll give you an example here shortly. And then different things to protect against respondent fatigue. Limiting open-ended, single choice, numeric, and ratings work. This is also an element of also being much more specific with our respondent. You know, research, I think in the US we get bombarded with all the different research that's being done. We're much more familiar with it. It's pretty new with our respondents, so they're very engaged. They really want to share their voices, but sometimes some of our more complex questions can be difficult to understand. So really, we try to really emphasize the need for simplicity, and that also speaks to a good translation. Make it fun as best as we can. Gamification doesn't necessarily need to be complex images and the like. You can actually do word association and make it fun within the actual questionnaire. Just an example here. You know, this is a very traditional question that we see a lot of. There's nothing wrong with it. It's quite wordy. And so what we see here is what are some of the reasons that would prompt you to go shopping for something to wear, and then you get your response options after that. One way to think about it when you're doing the survey design or when we're working with our clients is we recommend being a little bit more direct. So what events in your life make you go shopping for something to wear? Right? So it's very specific in terms of the words being used, and you still can get the response options here. I won't read them out loud, but you can get the response options and the insights that maybe the client's looking for still, but being a little bit more thoughtful of the wording. Every word counts on the mobile device. I think sometimes we tend to just assume everyone's taking it on a desktop computer. This, again, is just putting yourself in the shoes of the respondent.
Another classic example that we get, and you see in a lot of surveys, and it's not up here, but it's the do you work in any of these industries? And it's market research and advertising, the others, to screen people out. One of the contextual things that we've run into is that because we're paying people maybe as much as 50 cents or $1 in airtime, they actually think that they work in market research. That's their job. So that's actually, that's like, we have to train our users, no, you don't work in there, or we work with our clients and saying, no, this isn't the right sample, and we need to remove that screener question out of it. So it is a bit of a different context that you're coming through on that side as well.
Yeah, and on that, this kind of speaks to that context. Mobile data is expensive. Particularly in countries like South Africa, or all the countries we work in where it's prepaid, your cell phone plan is prepaid. So every decision you make is whether or not I'm going to spend my airtime and the money, the $5 I put on my account to access Facebook, to read the news, or to participate in this survey, which the incentive doesn't pay for my data costs. That of course, for the respondent is going to be a very easy decision to make. And then on top of that, that's where we encourage using small image sizes. So we know that there's a lot of packaging, all sorts of questionnaires and research questions that clients have that require images. We don't say that it's not that they can't be supported, but we try to think of ways to better design the survey to reduce the image sizes. So that just speaks to, you can't just clone a survey and then maybe try to run it in 3 different markets. You really have to think about maybe editing it to be more appropriate to the country you're trying to conduct the survey in. Increase incentive to cover data cost. Oftentimes, as Nick pointed out, for a 30-question survey with maybe a 30-second video, you're talking about a data cost in some of these countries of upwards of $1.50 for the data. When you look at average CPIs, you're getting pretty close to where the actual data cost translates into the CPI. That's not beneficial to the respondent. And doesn't make sense for GeoPoll ultimately, because we would lose that respondent because they're spending too much money. Browsers are basic. A big thing we've seen, one of the rules that we've used works out really well, with clients that are flexible and work with us is when they have a video, we actually suggest putting them in GIFs. So there's a nice nifty way to do that online, and you take that 30-second video and you change it into 10 quick images. You still get the same idea. You can still do an overall evaluation. It's just make sure it's more nuanced for the country that we're working in. Wording matters. In terms of the countries we work in, oftentimes understanding local context is important. A lot of my colleagues in Nairobi, they're not exactly sure what year they were born. That's just simply because it's not something that people talk about as often. It's really how old are you. So that's where a lot thinking about the do's and don'ts for the specific country and the context is going to be important. You have been selected the first versus reply one to take a survey. You've been selected. You feel more you picked or
Oh, they want to hear from me.
they want to hear from me, right? So that we've seen a dramatic increase in terms of response rates, and that's probably something that we would see here in the U.S. as well.
Another interesting tidbit on the what year were you born? We ran a survey in Afghanistan, and we started asking that question. We were getting back like answers like 1569 and 1583, and we're like, what is this? And we learned, okay, they actually locally use a different calendaring system than the rest of the world, and that's why we started switching to what year you were born for that reason. And sometimes they just don't know.
Despite the point I made about higher incentives, they're only going to lead to more completes up to a point. So there's, if clients do have limited budget, just because it's a difficult market, doesn't mean we have to charge too high of an incentive. You're going to start to see decreasing returns on that. And then needing to build trust with the respondents so they know you will deliver for the airtime that you promised them. This is a big challenge we've noticed in the past year when I was working very closely with the team on some of the marketplace surveys, where you have a respondent that takes 20 questions and then ultimately is screened out at the end. That's really just a bad respondent experience. It's a bad user experience. We got a lot of complaints related to that. So that's something that we want to help correct. So thinking about putting screeners at the beginning, allow GeoPoll to target. These are really basic things, but very important ultimately for the respondent experience. And then not only that, there are a lot of scams done in these where there's not as much regulations related to spamming and things like that. So GeoPoll prides ourselves with being able to deliver airtime credit immediately. We deliver it on the respondent's airtime account within 30 seconds of completing the survey. That's something we really want to do as we build trust with the respondents.
And the other big thing about building trust is not sending them surveys that they can't complete. So if you're sending a desktop survey to a basic phone, they will only click on that link so many times before they decide, hey, I'm not going to take any more surveys from this company anymore because it's a waste of time. So these are all very key, important things that we have to take into consideration.
Yeah, and there's a lot of other do's and don'ts that we'd be happy to share after this presentation or discuss separately. But I think these are some of the main takeaways I thought about when I was working and taking a look at a lot of the marketplace surveys that we've done in the past year. There certainly is a real appetite for respondents to share their opinions. It's amazing some of the data we collect. Some of the brands that we work with, some of the clients, are investing in the countries that we are. So to steal a little bit from what people were talking about earlier this morning, we feel very bullish about these opportunities. I think the important thing is not to take a US-based approach, not to take a European-based approach, not to take an African-based approach. It's about making sure that as you go on the journey for international expansion, that you're thinking about what makes the most sense for the respondents in that country and understand the local context.
With that, a little bit shorter than the time allotted, but that's okay. We can open it up to some questions. This is actually our team out of Nairobi, and we had a big group event last year. And so we are truly an international company that spent a lot of time working on these emerging markets.
Yeah. Unfortunately, the flight to Austin's a little expensive, so you got Nick and I, but we have a whole team behind us that are very dedicated researchers that work every day to try to optimize for better data collection in the countries we work in.
All right. Any questions?
Go ahead.
I'm just curious, you had said like a company like Philips wouldn't have a problem because they went to high end and they don't need to worry about this. But what kind of clients are interested in people with very low disposable incomes that can't afford very much?
You still buy toilet paper.
Yeah, it's a very.
You still buy toilet paper. You
You
still buy food. You still buy drinks.
So it's still that kind of
Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's just fascinating.
P&Gs and
Yeah, so the global brands are investing in there. Just the products that we have here are in the countries that we work in. I'll just give you a very concrete example. There was an FMCG client who was interested, had a business problem, right? Because they were sending packaging of toilet paper in packs of 6 or 12, right? And so actually, regular consumers couldn't buy the 6 or 12. And so there were middlemen and women who were upcharging and selling them individually and making a huge gain. So they said, okay, we clearly have a packaging problem here. What is the type of size that we should be selling? Should they be 2 packs? Should they just be individuals? And that was a big research, and there was a big business case that was done, and then research was conducted for that, just like any other packaging decision that's made, out here in Cincinnati. So there's a lot of investment on the local level for those types of questions. Yeah. Why Nairobi, Nick?
We started in Nairobi, or we started our office there because it's the culture there in Kenya is one that's very embracing of tech. So we were actually able to hire staff that had came out of really solid school background. The labor market was right for us, and it gave us that local context. So it's kind of a little bit of a tech hub there in Nairobi. It's been very helpful for us having that local presence there and making sure that we can hire people that have talent in the time zone that we're working in. And we could do a lot of business out of Nairobi as well. And then to answer your other question, who else does research there? We do a lot for aid organizations and other types of USAID funded work that they use market research to judge it's monitoring and evaluation of the program's success. So if they're digging wells, we ask them how their access to water is. If they're deploying food, then we ask them, did you have enough to eat? Did you go to bed hungry? Things like that. So really got that having that local context is really key for us in making sure that, we're not an American trying to go do our American surveys in Africa. That just doesn't translate one-to-one like you may assume.
Yeah, so it depends on the country. So we do English surveys in Kenya, and where the main language is English. So South Africa is one of those. But actually, we do primarily in most other countries the local language. So in Rwanda, you're going to do Kinyarwanda. In Ivory Coast, you'll do French. South Africa is actually a little bit different because there's 11 national languages. So that's where the nuance comes in, right? Where you could send in specific regions individual languages if you really wanted to, but English generally works.
In Kenya, we do dual language. It's Swahili and English, and they can choose at the beginning of the survey. The other one is in Nigeria. If we're targeting the north, we'll put in Hausa versus the south, which is going to be primarily English. When they have a national language and they learn to read and write in that, then you can generally get by.
Those languages tend to grow the lane or shorten?
When you get into complex character sets like Arabic, if you're doing an SMS survey, it cuts down your SMS from 160 down to 70. So yes, it is quite limiting. That means you have to send 2 messages to get your question out there, and it can increase your costs. So yes, there are some nuances there with the different languages and how it applies to text. Most of the African nations that we deal with are Latin character sets, so that's not as big of an issue. But once you get into Asia and Middle East and Asia, that becomes a bigger problem. Well, go ahead.
Is everyone opted in for being able to receive text then, or how exactly does that work for?
Yeah, it's not because we're doing it in partnership with the mobile network operators, and it's an offer almost of employment. It's not viewed as being spammed.
Okay.
So they'll allow us to, and it comes with the carrier's name on it. So they'll say Safaricom in Kenya. If you want to take surveys, reply 1 now to opt in. So they kind of have that one unsolicited message to go out and have them opt in that way.
But there does have to be, for our internal protocols, we have an opt-in with every questionnaire that we run still. So even on when we do like a marketplace one on the exchange, we send actually the link in as an SMS and say, if you want to choose to participate, click the link.
So are they charged for that text that they received?
No,
Nope.
so GeoPoll, yeah, it's free to respond to.
Okay.
Yeah. But once they click the link and they go to then it starts. The data would get.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. It's interesting. So probably the follow-up question is, so you work with the carriers to sort of reward or pay out airtime. Do they also allow you to profile or, find out beforehand what device they're using, where they're located, or what sort of profiling do they allow you to get?
With the mobile carriers, they don't have a ton of demographic information. It's all prepaid, so they have know your customer type of programs in just about every country, but it's always one person that goes in and buys 20 SIM cards and then hands them out to their family. So you don't really know your customer. You can get passive information like the tower that they're connected to get a rough radius of where they're at or we're at. You can get their device information. You can, and carriers' ability to disclose that depends on the country and their internal policies. Like I can tell you that MTN is very strict with data. Others are not as strict. Anything else? Well, if you have any other questions, feel free to hit us up after this, and appreciate everyone coming here and listening. Thanks.
Thank you, guys.